Welcome to Part 4 of the Whitman Ball Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 13. The patient slept soundly that night, but I did not. The shock of that sudden cry of "Halt!" just as I was about to make my big move left me rattled. I was uncertain about what it meant and how it might affect Mr. Monroe's situation. This turmoil kept me restless, my mind racing until the break of dawn. I felt exhausted, and I must have looked it because, as the first light of a weak sun crept into the room, Miss Harper opened her eyes and found me watching her. Her smile was filled with gentle compassion as she squeezed my hand and said, "You must have watched over me all night. I've never seen anyone look so tired or so good," she added softly. I wished she hadn't said that last part. It didn't sit right with me at that moment, and maybe not ever. Good, me, when my thoughts had been centered on Mr. Monroe, not her. The feeling in my heart was more one of regret, a longing to have made my critical test and established, at least for my own peace of mind, the complete innocence of my lover, even if it meant causing untold anguish to this trusting girl who would suffer greatly at the mere notion of wrongdoing. I must have flushed with embarrassment. Certainly, I must have given myself away, for her eyes sparkled with shy laughter as she whispered, "You don't like to be praised, another one of your virtues. You have too many. I have only one. I love my friends." And she did. It was clear that love was everything to her. For a moment I trembled at the thought of how close I had come to shattering this gentle spirit. Was she truly safe now? I wasn't so sure. My own doubts remained unresolved. I waited eagerly for the papers. They must hold important news. News of what? That was the question. "Will you let me see my letters this morning?" she asked, as I attended to her needs. "That decision is up to the doctor," I replied with a smile. "But you're definitely feeling better today." It's so hard for me to not read his letters, or write a word to ease his worries. In that moment, she revealed the secret of her heart, unknowingly adding another weight to my already heavy burden. As I made my way to arrange some orders for my patient's breakfast, Mr. Harper entered the sitting room and confronted me directly. He held a newspaper, and my heart dropped as I noticed his troubled expression and agitated demeanor. Was his anxiety caused by something he had read in those pages? It took all my strength to keep my gaze away from the paper, which he held in such a way that the bold headlines were almost illuminated. I dared not read them while his eyes were locked on mine. "How is Miss Harper? How is my daughter?" he asked urgently, clearly anxious. "Is she better this morning or worse?" "Better," I reassured him, and I was taken aback when I saw the tension in his brow instantaneously lift. "Really," he pressed, "you truly believe she's better? The doctors say so, but I have little faith in them when it comes to something like this," he added. "I haven't found any reason to doubt them," I insisted. "Miss Harper's illness, while serious, doesn't seem to be alarmingly so. However, I must admit I have very little experience outside of the hospital. I'm still quite young, Mr. Harper." He seemed to agree with my self-assessment, but with a still furrowed brow, he moved into his daughter's room, the newspaper clutched in his hand. Before I joined them, I found and glanced at another newspaper. Expecting significant news, I was both surprised and disappointed to see just a small paragraph dedicated to the Sinclair case. The authorities expressed hope that new information about the mystery would emerge once they tracked down a specific witness, whose link to the crime had just come to light. That was the entirety of Inspector Dalzell's letter. How could I endure the suspense and uncertainty while also fulfilling my responsibilities to my patient? Fortunately, I had no choice in the matter. I had been deemed capable of handling this situation, and now it was time to prove it. Maybe my courage would return after breakfast. Perhaps then I'd be able to figure out who this new witness was, something I found impossible at that moment. These thoughts swirled in my mind as I moved through the rooms on my way back to Miss Harper's bedside. By the time I reached her door, I was able to present a calm exterior, which her first words confirmed. Oh, the cheerful smile, It makes me feel better, even against my will. If only she could see how I felt inside. Mr. Harper, positioned at the foot of the bed, shot me a glance that was laced with suspicion. Had he caught on to my facade, or were his doubts simply reflections of his own anxiety? I couldn't determine the truth, and with yet another unanswered question weighing on me, I had to confront a day that might be just the beginning of many more just as difficult and unsatisfactory. But there was hope. Before noon, I received a message from my uncle asking to see me at his home around 3 o'clock, if I could be spared. What could he possibly want? I had no idea, and with a growing sense of unease, I sought Mr. Harper's permission before heading to my uncle. Upon arrival, I found him waiting in a carriage outside his house, and I climbed in next to him, utterly clueless about his intentions. I thought he had planned this ride so we could talk freely without the fear of being interrupted. But soon enough, I realized he had something else in mind. Not only did he head downtown instead of uptown, but his conversation, whatever little of it there was, stayed on vague topics and completely avoided the one subject we both cared about most. Finally, as we turned onto Bleecker Street, I couldn't hold back my confusion any longer. "Where are we going?" I asked. "You can't be taking me to see Mr. Monroe, can you?" "No," he replied tersely, offering no further explanation. "Oh, police headquarters," I exclaimed, my heart sinking as the carriage made another turn and stopped in front of a building that I recognized all too well. "Uncle, what am I supposed to do here?" "See a friend," he said, helping me out of the carriage. Then, as I followed him in a daze, he leaned closer and whispered, "Inspector Dalzell. He wants to talk to you for a few minutes." Oh, the relief that washed over me at those words. Finally, I would learn what had come between me and my goal. The long night I had dreaded was about to be brightened by a glimmer of understanding. I felt enough faith in the kind-hearted inspector to believe it would be good news. I grabbed my uncle's arm and squeezed it in delight, completely unaware of the curious stares I was attracting from various officials as we made our way to the inspector's office. When we found him waiting, a wave of joy surged through me at the sight of his warm and sincere face, so much so that I barely noticed my uncle slipping away until the door clicked shut behind him. "Oh, Inspector, what happened?" I blurted out in response to his greeting. "Is there something that will help Mr. Monroe without making Mr. Harper, do you have news for me as good as that?" "Not quite," he said, pulling up a chair and guiding me into it with a fatherly demeanor that felt more discouraging than comforting under the circumstances. "We've just learned of a new witness, or rather, a piece of information that has shifted our investigation in a different direction." "And you can't tell me what this information is?" I stammered, noticing he showed no sign of elaborating on this quite disheartening explanation. "I shouldn't, but since you've been willing to help us so much, I suppose I can set my principles aside just a bit to share something with you. After all, it only delays the reporters by a day. Miss Van Hayes, here's the story. Yesterday morning, a man was brought into this room, claiming he had information that might be relevant to the Sinclair case. I recognized him right away as one of the witnesses who made the inquest incredibly tedious. Do you remember Jones, the caterer, who had just a couple of facts to share, but took up the entire afternoon trying to express them?" "I certainly do," I replied. "Well, he was the one, and I have to admit I wasn't too thrilled to see him. However, he seemed more comfortable with me than I anticipated, and soon I discovered what he had to say. It was this. One of his waiters had suddenly left, one of his best workers, who had been with him at the Whitman Ball. It wasn't unusual for his staff to leave, but they typically gave notice. This man didn't. He simply didn't show up at his usual time. This happened a week or two ago. Jones, who liked the guy since he was an excellent waiter, sent a messenger to his boarding house to check on him. But he had left his lodgings with as little fanfare as he had when he departed from the caterer. Under normal circumstances, this would have settled the matter, but with a significant event on the horizon, Jones did not want to lose such a valuable man without making an effort to find him. So he searched through his references, hoping to uncover some clue about where he might be. He kept all these details in a special book, and assumed he would have no trouble locating the name of the man, James Wellgood, or his previous employer. However, when he went to consult this book, he was shocked to find that there was nothing recorded next to Wellgood's name except the date of his initial employment, March 15. Had he really hired him without a recommendation? That seemed unlikely, yet the page was devoid of any other information, just the name and the date. But that date, you've already noticed its significance, and so did he later on. It was the day of the Whitman Ball, the day of the notorious murder. As he recalled the events of that day, everything made sense. The absence of a reference for Wellgood was understandable. It had been a chaotic day overall. The event was crucial, and the weather was dreadful. Additionally, he had been short-staffed. 2 men had fallen ill that very morning, and when the capable-looking, self-assured Wellgood came forward for immediate employment, Jones had hired him with barely a glance at what appeared to be a satisfactory reference. He had meant to follow up on that reference later, having carefully pinned it along with other documents to his spike file. But in the confusion that followed the unfortunate events of that evening, he had let it slip his mind, feeling completely satisfied with the man's performance and demeanor. Now, however, things were different. The man had abruptly left him, igniting a strong urge to track down the person who had recommended him and find out if this was the first time Wellgood had repaid kindness with betrayal. As he rifled through the papers that filled his file, he realized the reference he sought was missing. This realization stirred him deeply, for he was sure he hadn't removed it, and no one else had the right to do so. He suspected a young boy who occasionally had access to his desk. Yet the boy was no longer in the office. He had let him go over a minor mistake the week before. It took him several days to locate the lad again. As his frustration mounted, when he finally confronted the boy, he accused him so passionately that it didn't take long for the boy to confess. The young lad admitted to taking the reference from the file, but claimed he only did so to give it to Wellgood, who had offered him money for it. When pressed about the amount, the boy revealed it was $10, a remarkable sum for a poor boy in exchange for such a simple favor, if Wellgood merely wanted it for future reference. This raised Mr. Jones's interest even further, leading him to dig deeper until he got what he hadn't dared to hope for at the start: the exact address of the person mentioned in the stolen reference, which, for some reason, the boy remembered clearly. It was an uptown address, and as soon as the caterer was free from his duties, he took the elevated train and headed to the designated street and number. When he arrived at Miss Van Hayes' place, he found that a surprise awaited him, as well as a revelation that awaited us all when he finally shared the outcome of his search. The name on the recommendation read, Hiram Sears, steward. He didn't recognize the name, perhaps you do, but when he arrived at the house where the recommendation was issued, he noted that it was one of New York's grandest residences, though he couldn't quite recall who lived there at that moment. However, he soon found out. The first passer-by he asked provided the answer, Miss Van Hayes. The address was 86th Street. I exclaimed, utterly shocked. You mean Mr. Sinclair himself, the husband of... Exactly. And Hiram Sears, someone you might have heard mentioned during the inquest, was not there in person for a very good reason. He's Mr. Sinclair's steward and general assistant. Oh, so, he was the one who recommended Wellgood. Yes. Did Mr. Jones meet with him? No, as you recall, the house is closed. When Mr. Sinclair left town, he gave his servant some time off. He took his steward with him, at least they left together. However, there's been no word about him in our telegrams from Santa Fe. It seems he didn't accompany Mr. Sinclair into the mountains. You say that in a strange way, I noted. Because it struck us as odd. Where is Sears now? And why didn't he travel with Mr. Sinclair when he clearly intended to go to the Placide mine? Miss Van Hayes, we were intrigued by this when we learned of Mr. Sinclair's solitary journey from where he became ill to his mine just outside Santa Fe. But we've only started to grasp its significance after hearing the news we received today. Miss Van Hayes, the inspector continued as I looked up with interest, I'm going to place a lot of trust in you. I'm going to share what our team has discovered about this Sears. As I mentioned earlier, This is just a way to delay the reporters by a day, and it may help you understand why I issued such urgent orders to stop, even when your heart was set on trying to clear Mr. Monroe's name. We cannot afford to disrupt such a prominent individual as the one you are observing while there remains even a hint of hope in connecting this crime to someone else. And we do have that hope. This man, Sears, is not the straightforward character one might expect from his position. Given how little time we've had, only yesterday did Jones find his way into this office. We've uncovered some intriguing facts about him. His loyalty to Mr. Sinclair was always apparent, and we knew all there was to know about that by the day after the murder. But his feelings for Mrs. Sinclair, that's another matter entirely. It wasn't until last night that we discovered the kind of attachment he felt for her, one that disregards age, appropriateness, or any other considerations. He wasn't a handsome man, and he was old enough to be her father, yet we've already identified several people who can recount stories of how intently his eager old eyes would follow her whenever they were thrown together under her husband's roof. Others tell, with even more enthusiasm, how he would spend hours in the nearby park just to catch a glimpse of her as she crossed the sidewalk to and from her carriage after moving into her own quarters. Indeed, his foolish, almost senile obsession with her beauty became the subject of gossip, and it only avoided mention at the inquest out of respect for Mr. Sinclair, who had never acknowledged this weakness in his steward, and because it seemed disconnected from her tragic death and the disappearance of her valuable jewel. We now have a witness, which is quite remarkable. It's amazing how many people we can uncover with just a bit of effort, people who never intended to come forward on their own. This witness claims he saw a man shaking his fist at a woman as she confidently walked past him into her apartment building. He is certain that the man was Sears, and the woman was Mrs. Sinclair. The only uncertainty he has is how his own wife will react upon learning that he was in that neighborhood that night when he was supposed to be elsewhere. The inspector chuckled. "Is the steward known to have a bad temper?" I asked, "that this show of emotion should have such an effect on you?" "I can't say for sure yet. People have differing views on this. His friends say he's the mildest man, lacking the natural ability to manage the large household he oversees. His critics, and we've discovered a few, claim that his quiet demeanor doesn't inspire trust, especially given that he was a California miner in the early 50s. You can see I'm bringing you as close to our conclusions as possible. I also want to mention that this apparent passion of the seemingly meek, but actually volatile steward for a woman who only treated him with a dismissive indifference stands out to us as a lead worth exploring, particularly after we got a reply to a telegram we sent last night to the nurse caring for Mr. Sinclair in New Mexico. He handed me a small yellow slip, and I read, "The steward left Mr. Sinclair at El Morro. He has not heard from him since. ANNETTLASCRRA. For nurse Sinclair." "At El Morro," I exclaimed. "That was some time ago. Long enough for him to have made it back to New York before the murder." "That's right, if he made the most of every close relationship." Chapter 14. I gasped, taken aback. I remained silent, unsure of how to respond to the inspector. He seemed to appreciate my hesitation, as his demeanor softened further when he said, "We absolutely need to locate this Sears. He's being sought everywhere, and we hope to discover where he is before nightfall, assuming he's still in the city. In the meantime, we're all relieved, especially Mr. Harper, to avoid causing him any unnecessary trouble." "And what about Mr. Monroe? What happens with him now?" "He'll have to wait for updates. I see no other option, my dear." Though his tone was gentle, my heart sank. This waiting was torturing both him and me. The inspector noticed and gave my hand a reassuring pat. Now, he said, "you know it's unwise to rush things." Then, perhaps to lift my spirits, he added, "There's another small detail that might interest you. It concerns the waiter, Wellgood, who was recommended by Sears. In my conversation with Jones, it casually came up that this Wellgood was the one who picked up the diamond after it fell from Mr. Harper's hand." "Oh, This may seem insignificant, it was to Jones, but I mention it because I'd like to ask you something related to it. You seem amused. Did I replied, trying to play innocent. I'm not sure why. That wasn't entirely true. I had been curious about the reason for the inspector's openness and his willingness to share so much. Now I understood. He wanted something from me. You were present at that very moment, he continued after studying my expression. You must have seen this man as he picked up the jewel and returned it to Mr. Harper. Did you notice his features? No, sir. I was too far away. Besides, my attention was on Mr. Harper. That's unfortunate. I was hoping you could help me with something crucial. What is that, Inspector Dalzell? Whether he fits this description. He picked up another sheet of paper, ready to read it aloud, but then someone entered the room, and the inspector immediately became engrossed in his presence. The newcomer looked as if he had been running or had just come from some wild escapade. In any case, the inspector stood as he walked in, about to question him, but then he remembered I was still there. Seeking a way to excuse himself without offending me, he opened the door to an adjacent room and kindly asked me to step inside while he spoke with the man. I complied, though I shot him a pleading glance as I did. It clearly affected him, as his expression shifted when he rested his hand on the doorknob. Would he lock me out, keeping me from whatever this man had to say, information that mattered to me as much as anyone else? Or would he recognize my anxiety, my need to understand the situation, and allow me to listen in? I watched the door closely as it creaked shut. It was closing too slowly to latch. Would he catch it and close it tightly? No, he left it ajar, and while the gap was barely noticeable, I felt certain that even the slightest vibration of the floor might widen it enough for me to hear. But I didn't need to wait long. The two men in the office I had just exited began to speak, and to my immense relief, their words were clear enough for me to listen intently. After the inspector expressed his surprise at the condition of the man in front of him, the man spoke up urgently. I just escaped death. I'll explain that later. Right now, you need to know that the man we're after is in town. I saw him last night, or at least his shadow. It was at the house on 86th Street, the one everyone thinks is closed. He entered with a key and... Hold on, you saw him. No, it's a complicated story, sir. Then tell it. The inspector's voice was flat, clearly disappointed. Don't judge me just yet, the man replied. He's no ordinary criminal. Here, how it went down. You needed the suspect's photograph and a sample of his handwriting. I figured the best place to find them was in his room at Mr. Sinclair's house. So I got the necessary warrant and headed out late last night. I went alone. I've always been a bit too self-reliant, unfortunately, and without any more caution than a quick word to the officer I passed at the corner, I hurried to the back entrance on 87th Street. You probably know there are 3 doors to the Sinclair house, 2 on 86th Street, the big front door, and a smaller one that leads directly to the turret stairs, and 1 on 87th Street. I had a key to that one. I don't think anyone noticed me enter. It was raining, and the few folks out were more focused on keeping their umbrellas up than on watching anyone hiding in doorways. Once inside, I made sure to close the door quietly behind me and climbed the first short flight of stairs to what I knew had to be the main hall. I had been given a layout of the interior, which I had studied somewhat before setting out, but I knew I would get lost if I didn't stick to the back staircase. At the top, I hoped to find the steward's room. Despite the closed shutters and tightly drawn shades, a faint light lingered in the house. Aware of my weakness for beautiful things, I hesitated to use my flashlight, knowing how difficult it would be to pass by so many exquisite rooms without peeking in. So I made my way upstairs, relying solely on the handrail for guidance. When I reached what I believed was the 3rd floor, I paused. It was incredibly dark, so I first listened, a natural instinct for us. Then I turned on my light to survey my surroundings. I found myself in a large hall, as empty as a vault, and nearly just as desolate. Blank doors surrounded me in every direction, with an occasional open passageway. I felt like I'd stepped into a maze. I had no idea which door I was looking for, and it's unsettling to turn unfamiliar knobs in a deserted house at midnight, especially with the rain pouring down in torrents and the wind howling through several enormous chimneys. But I had to press on, so I approached each door methodically until I came across a narrow one leading to the turret stair. This gave me my bearings. Sears' room was right next to the staircase. Finding the exact door was no longer a challenge, and after pausing just to close off the little staircase I'd opened, I crossed over and pushed the door wide open. My guess had been spot on. It was the steward's room, and I moved straight to the desk. "And what did you find?" "Mostly locked drawers, but a key on my ring opened some of them, and I used my knife on the rest. Here are the samples of his handwriting that I gathered. I doubt you'll get much from them." I found nothing out of the ordinary in the entire room, but I didn't have the time to inspect his trunks, one of which looked quite intriguing, old and worn as ever. "You didn't have time. What stopped you? What happened to make you leave in such a rush?" "Well, sir, let me explain." The way I said this seemed to catch his attention, even if it didn't the inspector's. I had just come from the desk, which had left me unsatisfied, and was scanning the room, which was as bare as my hand of anything resembling decoration, or I might even say comfort, when I heard a noise that was neither the sound of pouring rain nor a howling wind. Those had been constant companions. I didn't like that noise. It felt sneaky, so I quickly turned off my light. After that, I hurriedly slipped out of the room, since I don't fancy getting caught in a trap. The hallway seemed darker than ever as I edged back, and I stumbled upon an alcove in the wall where I hid. The sound I had heard wasn't just in my imagination. Someone else was in the house, making their way up the narrow turret stairs, lighting matches as they came closer. Who could it be? A detective from the district attorney's office? I doubted it. He'd likely have a better source of light. A burglar, not on the third floor of a house like this. Perhaps someone from the force who had seen me enter and managed, by some trick, to follow me. I needed to find out. In the meantime, I stayed crouched behind the wall and watched, unsure of where the intruder would go next. Whoever he was, he seemed startled to see the turret door slightly open, lighting another match as he pushed it wide. While I couldn't make out his figure, I did catch a clear view of his shadow. It was enough to trigger any detective's instincts right away. I didn't think to myself, this is the man I want, but I did recognize that he wasn't anyone from headquarters, and I braced myself for whatever might come next. The first thing that occurred was the match I'd lit going out suddenly, leaving the shadow in darkness. The intruder didn't strike another match. I heard him move across the floor quickly, the confident stride of someone who knows the layout well. Moments later, a gas jet flared up in the steward's room, and I realized that the man everyone was looking for had walked into a trap. You'd agree it wasn't my responsibility to apprehend him right away without understanding what he was after. He was believed to be in the eastern states, or perhaps the south or west, yet here he was. But why here? That's what I figured you'd want to know, and it was exactly what I wanted to find out myself. So I remained where I was, which was a decent spot, and just listened, since I couldn't see. What was he doing? What could he want in this empty house at midnight? First, he seemed to be looking for papers, then clothes. I heard him rummaging through the desk, then moving to the closet, and finally fiddling around with the old trunk I had been so eager to examine myself. He must have brought the key, because it wasn't long before I heard him tossing out the contents in a frantic search for something he needed urgently. He found it faster than you'd think, and as he began to throw things back, something caught his eye. Whether it was expected or not, he suddenly erupted in loud exclamations that turned into groans. Eventually, he began kissing this object with a fervor that hinted at anger mixed with a tenderness that bordered on agony. I had never encountered anything like it. My curiosity was so piqued that I was about to risk everything just for a glimpse when he suddenly snarled and shouted, loud enough for me to hear, "To kiss what I've hated, that's as bad as killing what I've loved." Those were his exact words. I know he said kiss, and I know he said kill. This is quite intriguing. Please, continue your story. Why didn't you confront him while he was in that state? You could have taken him by surprise. I didn't have a pistol, sir, but he did. I heard him cock it and thought he was about to take his own life, so I held my breath, expecting the shot. But that wasn't his intention at all. Instead, he set the pistol down and deliberately ripped apart whatever it was that had angered him. Then, with a muffled curse, he headed for the door and the turret staircase. I wanted to follow him, but first I needed to see what he had destroyed in such a fit of rage. I thought I knew, but I needed to be sure. So before risking my safety in the turret, I crept into the room he had just left and felt around on the floor until I found these. A torn photograph, Mrs. Sinclair. Yes, haven't you heard how much he loved her? It was a foolish obsession, but clearly sincere and... Skip the commentary, Sweetwater. Stick to the facts. Of course, sir. The facts are intriguing enough. After I gathered up the torn pieces, I quietly made my way back to the turret staircase. That's where I made my first mistake. I stumbled in the darkness, and he heard me. The pistol clicked again. I didn't like that at all, and I considered backing out of the whole thing. But I didn't. I just waited until I heard him moving again, then I followed. Very cautiously this time. It felt like descending into a well where death might be waiting at the bottom. I could see nothing, and before long I could hear nothing but the faint sliding of my own fingers along the curve of the wall, which was my only guide. Was he standing just ahead? Would I first sense his presence through the cold metal of a weapon, or by the sudden grip of two lethal arms? The wall remained smooth with no breaks, so I hadn't yet reached the second story. When I finally did, I would face a choice. Should I leave the staircase to search for him in the vast rooms ahead, or should I continue down to the parlor floor and on to the street, possibly where he was headed? I was nearly tempted to switch on my light and confront whatever lay ahead, but I reminded myself how little help I would be to you lying in this dark staircase with a bullet wound, so I steadied myself and pressed on as I had begun. In the next moment, my fingers brushed against the edge of an opening, and I realized the time for a decision had come. Understanding that no one can move so silently as to elude detection, I paused, waiting for the sound I knew would betray him. When a click echoed from the depths of the hallway in front of me, I plunged into that space and into the heart of the house. In here, the darkness wasn't as thick, though I still couldn't make out the shapes of the objects I occasionally bumped into. I passed a mirror. I'm not sure how I recognized it as such, and in that mirror I thought I caught a glimpse of something that flickered by like a ghost and then vanished. It was too unnerving. I muttered a curse under my breath and pressed forward, only to collide with a closing door. The door swung open again, and I rushed inside, flicking on my light in a desperate attempt to gain clarity. Instead of the sharp crack of a gunshot I had expected, I heard a second door slam shut in front of me, accompanied by a sound like a spring lock snapping into place. Realizing that progress was barred ahead, I quickly turned back toward the entrance I had come through, only to find that it too had closed at the same moment, a single mechanism operating both doors. I was trapped, a prisoner in a peculiar passageway or closet. A quick scan around me confirmed my grim situation. I had very little hope of immediate escape. The doors were solid, with no locks to pick or panels to break through, and the space was devoid of windows. The only connection to the outside world was a narrow shaft rising from the ceiling almost to the top of the house. Whether it functioned as ventilation or simply provided light when both doors were shut, it was far too high to offer any real chance of escape. Never has a man felt so thoroughly confined. As I grasped how slim my chances were for outside help, how my captor could easily leave the house and be mistaken for me by the officer on duty, I couldn't help but feel utterly hopeless. Anger, however, is a powerful motivator, and I was seething, not only with Sears but with myself. After a bout of cursing, I took another look around. With no way through the walls, I turned my full attention to the shaft, which might just lead me out if I could find a way to climb it. And guess how I eventually did manage to achieve that. A glance at my messy, lime-covered clothes might give you a hint. I climbed an opening in the sheer walls like the boy did on the Natural Bridge in Virginia. Do you recall that old tale from the reader? It struck me as a sudden spark of inspiration while I stood gazing up from below. I realized I'd have to navigate most of the way in complete darkness, but I figured a man's life was worth a bit of risk. I'd rather take a fall and break my neck trying to escape than spend hours in maddening stillness, only to face death by slow starvation. I had a knife, a really sharp one, tucked in my pocket, and for the first few steps I had the glow of my electric torch. The first challenge was reaching the shaft from where I stood on the floor. The room held only one piece of furniture, which was a mix between a table and a desk. No chairs, and the desk wasn't high enough for me to reach the opening of the shaft. I thought if I could stand it on its end, I might have a chance. It didn't seem likely, but I took off my coat and threw myself into the task with determination. Whether I was granted some superhuman strength, or maybe the clunky thing wasn't as heavy as it appeared, I eventually managed to balance it on its end, just under the opening of the shaft. Next, I had to figure out how to climb on top of it. That felt almost as impossible as scaling the bare wall itself, but then inspiration struck. I recalled the drawers, and although they were locked, I managed to unlock enough of them with my keys to create a makeshift set of stairs. Now I could see the opening of the shaft, but what lay beyond? I took out my knife and tested the edge. It was sharp, and the point was good as well, but would it be enough to dig through plaster? That depended on how sturdy the plaster was. Had the masons, in finishing that shaft, ever considered the poor soul who would one day have to face the hardness of the final cover? My first attempt would reveal everything. I confess, I trembled at the thought of what that initial test would mean for me, wondering if the sweat starting to pour from every pore came from the physical strain or just raw fear. Inspector, I won't drag you through the 5 grueling hours that followed. I managed to pierce that plaster with my knife, going deep enough to create space for my fingertips and later for the tips of my toes. I dug, pried, sweated and panted, constantly listening, first for a sudden opening of doors below me, then for any shout or interference from above. I worked my way up inch by inch, foot by foot, toward what might or might not be safety. 5 hours, 6. Then I struck something solid. It turned out to be a window. When I realized this and understood that with just one more push I could breathe freely again, I came closer to collapsing than I had at any time during this harrowing climb. Fortunately, I sensed the danger and managed to position myself in a way that held me steady until the dizzy moment passed. Then I pressed on calmly, and within another half hour I reached the window, which, thankfully, not only opened inward but was also unlatched. It was with an overwhelming sense of relief that I clambered through the window and caught a brief whiff of the sharp scent of cedar. But that moment was fleeting. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon before I found myself back in the fresh air outside. The only way I can explain the passage of time is that the pressure on both my body and nerves was too much, even for someone as resilient as I am. I collapsed on the floor of the cedar closet and fell into a faint that turned into a deep sleep lasting until 2 o'clock. I can certainly explain the last hour, since it took me that long to cut through the thick paneling of the closet door. But here I am now, sir, in nearly the same state as when I left that house. I felt it was my duty to tell you that I saw Hiram Sears in that house last night, and to point you in his direction. I took a deep breath, and I think the inspector did too. I had been nearly frozen with excitement, and I sensed he felt some of it as well. Yet his voice was steadier than I had anticipated when he finally spoke. I'll remember this. It was a good night's work. The inspector then asked him several questions, which seemed to confirm that Sears had left the house before Sweetwater did. After that, he instructed him to summon certain men to him, and then to tidy himself up. I think he had forgotten about me entirely. I had almost forgotten about myself. Chapter 15. I was finally summoned back into the inspector's presence after he had given several orders. He smiled when our eyes met, but we both chose not to mention what had just happened. Still, there was an unspoken understanding between us. Once I was seated again, he picked up our conversation right where we had left off. The description I was about to read to you, he continued. Would you care to hear it now? Of course, I replied. It's about Wellgood, I believe. He didn't respond directly, just gave me a curious look from beneath his brows, but then he pulled the paper from his desk and resumed reading. A man, 55 years of age but appearing older, of medium height with unremarkable features. His head is mostly bald, save for a thin ring of dark hair. He has no beard, a prominent nose, a long mouth, and sleepy, half-closed eyes that can shoot strange glances. There's nothing particularly distinctive about his face or figure aside from deep wrinkles and a barely noticeable stoop in his right shoulder. "Do you see Wellgood in that?" he suddenly asked. I can barely remember what he looked like, I admitted, unsure. But this description doesn't quite match my fleeting impression of that waiter. "Others have said the same," he remarked, sounding quite disheartened. "This description was given to me by someone who knew Sears well. If we could match the details of this description to the waiter, we'd be making progress. However, the few people who have laid eyes on Wellgood remember his features quite differently, even down to his coloring. It's astonishing how little attention most people pay to someone, even when they see them every day." Mr. Jones recalls the man's eyes as grey, and claims his hair is a wig and dark, with a pudgy nose and a rather expressionless face. His landlady, on the other hand, says his eyes are blue, his hair, whether a wig or not, dusty auburn, and his look was sharp and piercing, which always frightened her. She doesn't remember anything about his nose. Everyone agreed, or rather, all of them did, that he didn't have a beard. Sears did, but a beard can be easily removed. They all insisted that they would recognize him right away if they saw him. And so, that's where we stood. Even you can't provide me with a specific description, one that's any more satisfying or unsatisfactory than Sears's. I shook my head. Like the others, I felt I'd recognize him if I came across him, but I couldn't say much more than that. There seemed to be so little distinctive about the man. The inspector, perhaps hoping that all this would jog my memory, shrugged his shoulders and tried to make the best of it. "Well, well," he said, "we'll have to be patient. A day can change everything in our perspective if we can get our hands on either of these men." He seemed to realize he had said too much and quickly shifted gears, asking whether I had managed to obtain a sample of Miss Harper's handwriting. I had to admit I hadn't. Everything had been stored away very carefully. "But I can come across it at any moment," I added. "I haven't forgotten its significance for this investigation." "Very good. Those lines that were handed to Mrs. Sinclair from the walkway outside are the second most valuable clue we have." I didn't need to ask what the first was. I already knew. It was the stiletto. "It's strange that no one has come forward about that handwriting," I remarked. He looked at me, surprised. 50 people have sent in writing samples they believe resemble it," he replied. "Often from individuals who have never even heard of the Sinclairs. We've been quite troubled by this matter. You have little idea of the challenges the police face." "I know too much," I sighed. He smiled and gave my hand a reassuring pat. "Go back to your patient," he said. "Forget every other responsibility other than your calling until I have definite news for you. I won't keep you in suspense a moment longer than necessary." He stood up and I followed suit. Yet I felt uneasy. I couldn't leave the room with my thoughts, and frankly my convictions, so unsettled. "Inspector," I said, "you may think I'm being stubborn, but everything you've told me about Sears, everything I've heard about him, in fact," I placed extra emphasis on this, "doesn't convince me that my suspicions are completely unfounded. In fact, if anything, they have only grown stronger. This steward, I admit, is a questionable character. He may well have had his reasons for wanting Mrs. Sinclair dead, or even played a part in it. But what evidence do you have that he actually entered the alcove, delivered the fatal blow, or stole the diamond? I've been eagerly listening for that kind of evidence, but I've found nothing." "I understand," he replied softly, "I understand, but it will come, at least I hope so." This should have eased my mind, should have allowed me to leave satisfied. Yet something, the strength of my conviction, perhaps, made me linger before the inspector, finally giving me the courage to say, "I know I shouldn't say another word. I know I put myself at a disadvantage by doing so, but I can't help it, Inspector. I can't hold back when I see you emphasizing the scant indirect clues linking the suspicious Sears to this crime, while overlooking the direct ones we have against a certain person we need not name. Had I overstepped? Had I pushed my luck too far, inviting his justifiable anger? Instead, he simply smiled, a cryptic smile that I found hard to decipher, but still a smile. "You mean," he said thoughtfully, "that Sears' potential involvement in the crime doesn't negate Mr. Harper's clear involvement, nor does the fact that Wellgood's hand touched Mr. Harper, around the time the fake stone was swapped for the real one, did nothing to clarify who was truly responsible for the switch." The inspector had his hand on the doorknob, but he paused at my words and studied me quietly. I thought that a few days spent at Miss Harper's bedside, in the company of her distinguished father, would rid you of these damaging suspicions. "I can see why you would think that," I exclaimed. "You'd understand even more if you saw how kind he can be and how much he cares for those around him. But I can't shake off the facts. They all seem to point in one direction." "All of them. You heard what was said in this room. I could see it in your eyes. The man who caught the steward in his own quarters last night overheard him speaking about love and death concerning Mrs. Sinclair. 'To kiss what I hate. It's almost as bad as killing what I love.' He said something like that." "Yes, I heard that. But does he mean that he's actually killed her? Could you convict him based on those words?" "Well, we shall see. Now, regarding Wellgood's involvement, you believe the exchange took place when the stone slipped from Mr. Harper's hand. What proof do you have that the switch you suspect wasn't made by him? He could have easily done it while crossing the room to Mr. Harper's side." "Inspector," I retorted, feeling the absurdity of the suggestion hit me fully. "He could do this. A waiter, or as you think, Mr. Sinclair's steward, would somehow have access to such a rare item as this unique counterpart of a precious stone. Isn't that as astonishing a theory as any I've dared to propose?" "Perhaps, but the whole situation is filled with unbelievable elements, the most striking of which, in my view, is how you, a kind-hearted woman, continue to attribute the gravest guilt to someone you claim to admire, and who you would surely prefer to see innocent of any involvement in such a terrible crime." I felt compelled to defend myself. "Mr. Monroe hasn't received any consideration," I said. "I understand, my dear, I truly do. However, the circumstances are not the same. Would it not be wise for you to recognize this and find contentment with how things have unfolded, without persistently dragging Mr. Harper into your suspicions?" A smile tempered this admonition, but I felt it acutely, and it was only my faith in his fairness as a man and a public servant that allowed me to respond. "I'm speaking quite candidly. You have shown me such kindness, being so open to all my thoughts, that I can't help but share everything with you. It's my only release. You know how I must sit in the presence of this man with my thoughts all bottled up. It's unbearable. But if you would indulge me one last suggestion before I take my leave, I would be grateful. It's my final thought." "Speak freely. I am nothing if not patient." He had spoken the truth. Patient, indeed. That's what he was. He let me voice my concerns, likely out of kindness from the very beginning. He didn't fully trust my judgment or reasoning, but I wouldn't be discouraged. I needed to clear my mind of the dark thoughts that had settled there. I would not leave behind any lingering doubts to fester and torment me through the lonely hours of the night that lay ahead, so I took him up on his offer. "I just wish to ask this. If Sears is innocent, then who issued the warning, and where did the assassin obtain the stiletto with the Harper crest embossed on its handle? And what about the diamond? You suggest he stole that as well. You say he had some notion that a fake stone would come in handy for this grand occasion, yet he has shown no interest in Mrs. Sinclair's diamond, only in Mrs. Sinclair herself. If Wellgood is Sears, and Sears facilitated the switch between the fake stone and the real one, then he did so for Mr. Harper's benefit rather than his own. But I don't believe he was involved at all. Everything points to the conclusion that Mr. Harper himself made the switch." "A second Daniel," the inspector said with a light chuckle. "Please continue, little lawyer. Yet despite his light-hearted banter, I sensed he was eager to wrap up the conversation. So I rushed to finish my thoughts, stumbling over my words in my excitement. Think about the flawless imitation stone, a copy so precise that it includes the setting. That indicates planning, sorry for the repetition, preparation, and an understanding of gemstones, especially this one. Mr. Sinclair's steward may have had that expertise, but he would be foolish to use it to acquire something valuable that he could never sell in any market. But a collector, someone who takes pleasure in owning a rare and priceless gem, that's a different story. He might take the risk of committing a crime. History is filled with such cases. I paused to catch my breath, allowing the inspector to interject. In other words, you believe the Englishman, keen on covering his tracks, came up with the idea of having this imitation ready in case it would serve him in the audacious and shameful act you attribute to him. Acknowledging his own lack of skill in this matter, he passed the responsibility to someone who, for some reason, he believed held a hidden resentment towards the current owner, a man who had had the chance to see the diamond and examine its setting. With the replica obtained, Mr. Harper arrived at the ball, confident in his seemingly unshakable position. He confronted Mrs. Sinclair in the alcove, planning to claim the diamond, but it wasn't where he had noticed it earlier, sparkling on her dress. The warning she had received, a warning you attribute to his daughter, though that remains to be confirmed, had prompted her to dispose of the jewel in the manner Mr. Monroe described, leaving him with the burden of a cowardly act and nothing to show for it. Later, to his shock and possible delight, he spotted that diamond in my hands. Seizing what he thought was a chance to still acquire it, he asked to examine it, briefly held it, and then, employing a nearly unbelievable trick to divert attention, he dropped the fake stone while keeping the real one hidden in his palm. In straightforward terms, this, I believe, is how you currently perceive the situation. Surprised by how accurately he interpreted my thoughts, I replied, "Yes, Inspector, that's exactly what I was thinking." "Excellent. It's good to articulate these thoughts. Your mind is now clear, allowing you to focus entirely on your responsibilities." As he grasped the doorknob, he added, "In your deep contemplation of your own perspective, you seem to have overlooked that the last thing Mr. Harper would likely do in such a situation would be to highlight the falsehood of the gem he was counting on appearing real. Not even his confidence in his esteemed position as a respected guest would compel him to act that way. What if he were a renowned connoisseur? I hesitated. Someone proud of having handled the finest gems. He'd realize that the deception would soon be uncovered, and it wouldn't reflect well on him to fail recognizing it for what it was when the fake was right in front of him. Forced, my dear, entirely forced, as fantastical as all the rest. It's a notion that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Let me be frank with you. You're a sensible girl and can handle the truth from me. I can't buy into your theory. I've never been able to, and neither have any of my men. But if your ideas hold any weight, and Mr. Harper is indeed mixed up in this, you should know there's more to the situation with that diamond than you, in your innocence, realize. If Mr. Harper really possessed it, he wouldn't be as worried as you claim. The same goes if Wellgood had it with his blessing, and a good chance of it coming back to him soon. But if it's in Wellgood's hands against his will, or if there's no chance of him getting it back, then his current anxiety and growing distress would make perfect sense. "That's true," I murmured. "Then," the inspector continued, giving me a final look that held a mix of humor and a hint of something more serious beneath the surface, "if we follow this lead, and find that Mr. Harper has been in contact with either Wellgood or Sears, or if you, with your knack for uncovering the truth, notice he shows any unusual interest in either of them, the situation will change entirely. But we aren't there yet. Right now, our job is to locate one or the other of these men. If we are fortunate, we may find that the waiter and the steward are one and the same, despite their seemingly different exteriors. A rogue like Sears has proven himself to be skilled in the art of disguise." "You're right," I replied. "He certainly has the heart of a criminal. If he wasn't involved in Mrs. Sinclair's murder, he came close to being involved in that of your detective. You know what I mean. I couldn't help but overhear, Inspector." He smiled, held my gaze for a moment, and then graciously escorted me out. Later, the inspector informed me that, despite his casual dismissal of my suggestions, he spent a very serious half-hour discussing the matter with the district attorney. The outcome was the following instruction for Sweetwater, the detective. You are to go to the St. Regis, make yourself well liked there, and gradually, as you can manage it, work your way into a position to learn all that goes on in room. If the gentleman, mind you, the gentleman, we have no interest in the women, should leave, you are to follow him wherever it may lead. We need to uncover his secret, but he must never know we're interested, and you are to remain as silent as if you had no ears or tongue at all. I should add, Memory, if this secret turns out to be one in which we have no legal interest, you are to forget it completely and forever. You will understand why once you consult the St. Regis Register. Yet they expected nothing from it, absolutely nothing. Chapter 16. I pleaded with my uncle to take the route home via 86th Street. I wanted to see the Sinclair house. I had laid eyes on it many times before, yet after the story I had just heard in the inspector's office, I felt I needed to look at it anew. The notion that such an adventure could unfold in a New York house stretched my belief. In Paris, with its wicked allure and air of mystery, the hub of intrigue and unspeakable crimes, I could have accepted it as plausible. But in our own familiar, everyday metropolis, I required proof to warrant the tale I had just heard. Many of you are acquainted with the building, often dismissed with a shrug. It seems the sole reason for this reaction is that there's nothing quite like it in the city. I have always found it grand and majestic, yet to the average person, it evokes a sense of old-world feudal life that doesn't sit well. On this dreary afternoon, the mansion appeared undeniably heavy as we drew near, yet it intrigued me in an entirely new way because of the tall turret at one corner. The sight of that midnight encounter between two men, both terrified of the other, yet resolute in their aims, one seeking escape, the other in pursuit. There was no railing in front of the house, perhaps deemed unnecessary by its audacious owner. Consequently, the small door in the turret opened directly onto the street, allowing easy access for anyone possessing the key. But where was the shaft, and the little room at its base? Naturally, it was situated in the heart of the towering structure, the room devoid of windows. Thus, searching for it was futile. Still, my gaze roamed along the peaks and spires of the roof, hunting for the skylight through which it must surely be illuminated. Finally, I spotted it, and with my curiosity about this resolved, I began to scan the sides and front of the building, searching for an open window or a lifted shade. But everything was tightly shut, offering no more signs of life than the boarded-up door. Still, I wasn't fooled by this. As we drove away, I thought about how tomorrow there would be a steady stream of people passing through this street, eager to see the little I had witnessed today. The detective's case was bound to make the house well known. For several minutes after leaving the area, I imagined room after room sealed off from sunlight, yet filled with the unsettling presence of those two shadows moving through them, as the detective had aptly described. The heart holds its own surprises. Throughout my ride, indulging in these thoughts, I felt an overwhelming internal struggle against everything I had suggested, and even truly felt while speaking to the inspector. Perhaps this was exactly what the wise old official had anticipated. He let me speak, and the inevitable backlash followed. Now, all I could see was Mr. Hopper's goodness and reasons for respect, and I began to despise myself for not being immediately convinced by the inspector's perspective, for not being more willing to cast aside any doubts about the esteemed figure I had foolishly linked to crime. What had driven me to hold on? Loyalty to my lover. His innocence had never been in question. In fact, every word exchanged in the inspector's office had shown me that he no longer occupied a significant place in their investigation. Their focus had shifted elsewhere, and all I had to do was be patient to see Mr. Monroe completely cleared in their eyes. But was that really the case? Was he truly safe? What if this new lead turned out to be nothing? What if they couldn't find Sears or get their hands on the questionable Wellgood? Would Mr. Monroe be released without a trial? Would we hear nothing more of the strange, and for many, suspicious circumstances tying him to this crime? It seemed unreasonable to expect either the police or public judgment to be that fair. No, Mr. Monroe would never be fully cleared until the real culprit was found, and all explanations were given. I had simply been fighting his battles by pointing out what I believed to be the weak point in their current theory. Even though I felt guilty for my seemingly heartless action, I knew I wasn't the unfeeling, foolish person the inspector must have thought I was. Yet, my comfort was minimal, and the effort it took to face Mr. Harper and my young patient was far greater than I had expected. I felt my cheeks heat as I moved to take my place beside Miss Harper's bed, and if her father had been as suspicious of me as I was of him at that moment, I was certain my standing in his eyes would have been far worse. Fortunately, he wasn't focusing on my feelings. He was simply relieved to see me back. I noticed that he was preoccupied with something that seemed to be weighing on his mind. At his feet lay a Western Union envelope, evidence that he had just received a telegram. Normally, I wouldn't think much of it. A man like him typically got all sorts of communications from around the world. But with a nagging doubt still gnawing at my heart, everything he did struck me as significant and raised questions. After he left the room, Miss Harper turned to me with a sincere comment. "Poor Papa, something bothering him. He won't tell me what it is. I guess he thinks I'm not strong enough to share his worries. But I will be soon. Can't you see I'm getting better every day?" "I truly can," I replied warmly. Faced with her sweet trust and open affection, my doubts melted away, and I focused entirely on her. "I wish Papa felt as confident about this as you do," she said. "For some reason, he doesn't seem to find any comfort in my improvement. When Dr. Frelig says, 'Well, well, we're making good progress today,' I notice that his expression doesn't lighten, and he doesn't even respond with a smile. Have you noticed that? He appears just as anxious and troubled about me now as he did on the first day I fell ill. Why is that? Could it be that after losing so many children, he can't allow himself to believe in the good fortune of having the most insignificant one left to care for?" "I don't know your father very well," I replied. "I can't judge what he might be thinking, but surely he must see that you're a different girl than you were a week ago. If nothing unexpected happens, your recovery should just be a matter of a week or two more." "Oh, how I love to hear you say that. To be well again, to read letters," she murmured, "and to write them." I watched as her delicate hand reached out to touch the precious packet waiting for her to be well again. Not wanting to discuss her father with her, I used this moment to shift the conversation to safer topics. However, we hadn't gone far when Mr. Harper returned. Standing at the foot of the bed, he paused, casting a gloomy glance at his daughter's face before saying, "The doctor says you're feeling better today. I just spoke with him over the telephone. But do you think you're well enough for me to leave you for a few days? There's a man I need to see, and I must go if you're not afraid to stay alone with your good nurse and the doctor's constant care." Miss Harper looked taken aback. It must have been confusing for her to understand what man in this strange country could interest her father enough to make him want to leave her, especially given his current worries. But a smile soon replaced her look of surprise, and she affectionately responded, "Oh, I'm not afraid at all, not now. Look, I can lift my arms." "Go on, Papa, go. It will give me a chance to surprise you with how I look when you return." He turned away abruptly, grappling with an emotion deeper than he wanted to admit. However, he soon regained his composure and returned with a forced resolve. "I have to leave tonight. There's no other choice. Promise me you won't give up while I'm gone. Promise me you'll fight to get well, that you'll focus all your energy on getting better." "I will, I promise," she replied, a bit taken aback by his intensity. "You shouldn't worry so much. I have plenty of reasons to keep living, Papa." He shook his head and immediately set to work making his departure arrangements. His daughter let out a single sob before taking my hand. "You look stunned," she said, "but don't worry, we'll manage just fine together. I have complete faith in you." Should I inform the inspector that Mr. Harper planned to be away from the city for a few days? I decided that bringing it up would only cast my own uncertainties upon him after he had just reassured me. Still, as Mr. Harper prepared to leave, I couldn't help but wish the inspector had been there to witness his emotional turmoil. if only for one of his insightful explanations. The farewell felt more like that of someone unsure when they might return, rather than a traveller promising to be back in a few days. He held her gaze and kissed her repeatedly, each kiss laced with a heartache that was draining for both of them. When he finally pulled away, he glanced back at her from the door with a look I was relieved she did not see. It would surely have disrupted her promise to concentrate all her efforts on getting well. What could be behind his overwhelming sorrow at leaving her? Did he fear the person he was about to meet, or did his plans entail a much longer stay than he had indicated? Did he even plan to come back at all? That was the real question. Did he mean to return, or had I unknowingly witnessed his escape?